Welcome back to coverage here at GP Memphis. I'm Marshall Sutcliffe. I'm in the booth with Reed Duke. And in our feature match area, it is time for MTG Red Zone. This is where we kick it up a notch on our march up to the top 8. Matthew Kling, Reed, this is our last undefeated, truly no blemishes on the record player left in the field. Now, technically, Brad is also undefeated. He has yet to take an actual loss in the tournament, though he has picked up a draw yesterday. So these players really near the top of the standings. We've got blue-black mid-range, the deck that Brad and the two gentlemen that he drove down here from Roanoke with kind of are pioneering. Matthew's on Grixis Energy. What do you make of this Grixis Energy deck?
Well, Grixis Energy, yesterday I mentioned it as the heir apparent of the Teamer Energy deck that was the most popular and successful deck in Standard before the banning of Attune with Ether and Rogue Refiner. Mm-hmm. So this deck maintains the Ether Hub, Whirler Virtuoso, Harness Lightning shell that pulled a lot of weight in the Teamer deck, but of course, now that the two best energy-based green cards are not available, shifting the colors and employing slightly different overall structure to the deck.
Kind of interesting here for Nelson. He plays Chart a Course on turn 3, sometimes an indication that he'd like to hit a land drop, but he actually pitches a land to it and still hits his land drop, so that didn't look like it was the case. Oh, and look at this. Matthew Kling says, I'll take a Chart a Course, thank you very much.
Yeah, wow, that Chart a Course winding up being a real liability for Brad. That's one thing about this blue-black mid-range deck is it plays with Chart a Course and Champion of Wits, which are both cards that don't really get you ahead when you cast them early in the game. Neither one, well, assuming you don't have the raid on Chart a Course, neither one is going to net you card advantage. They're more just to help you smooth your draw, make sure you're finding your removal spells, finding your land drops, and getting up to that Scarab God in a reasonable position. But they don't really do much. You'd much prefer to just have a smooth draw normally and be adding creatures to the board. And here, between Brad not getting ahead on his turn 3 by casting Chart a Course and Matthew Kling taking advantage with the Direfleet Daredevil, it looks like the Grixis player is pulling ahead a little bit.
Wow, fearless play here for Matthew Kling. Just windmill slams the Scarab God here on turn 5. Now, Brad does have the answer for it. He didn't have a counterspell, but you see, they're playing very quickly, which I can certainly appreciate. But Brad's not actually tapping his mana. So he did cast Vraska's Contempt to take care of it. And that is one of the best answers in the format. If you can't counter it, well, you might want to get the thing exiled. And that's exactly what Brad does. Now, can Brad answer? Can he say, I got the Scarab God? He has it in his deck, right?
Yeah, these actually are two pretty similar takes on, well, using the same strategy to try to win the game. These are both mid-range decks. They have certain elements of control, certain elements of just, creature beatdown. But basically, both decks are creating a nice shell of threats and answers to support one of the most powerful cards in the format, the Scarab God.
Right.
In this case, it looks like Matthew deployed the first one, Brad answered, but both players just looking to create a safe window to get that card into play, because once you do, it's usually lights out pretty quickly.
Brad's going to cycle the Fetid Pools, but otherwise do nothing, and Matthew's going to do nothing on his turn before or play a land and then pass the turn back. And here's Brad once again sort of working his way up the chain. Champion of Wits, similar to how you described. Oh, look at this, Supreme Will from Matthew Kling. He's having none of it. You don't often see that happen, but
yeah,
Matthew just, I guess, wants to keep the board clear.
I would be inclined to save Supreme Will for a more potent threat, or potentially just use the Impulse, the look at the top 4 cards mode. Mm-hmm. I think Champion of Wits really was just a bait spell, sort of Brad Nelson spinning his wheels because he didn't have anything pressing to use his mana on. But now, because of that exchange, that Brad was able to get a 1-for-1 against a pretty potent card in Supreme Will, he now has the advantage because the Champion of Wits wound up in his graveyard. He's only 1 land away from hitting 7, and with both players on a high life total, the raw card advantage of eternalizing that Champion of Wits is probably going to lead Brad into a big advantage.
Really interesting as well. You saw that Brad played a land after casting his Champion of Wits. Now, he may have wanted it in hand to discard it, but it also gives at least some indicator to the level of importance that he put on it, knowing that he left it open to being Supreme Willed.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And I wonder if Matthew's like, oh, well, if you didn't even care that much about it, maybe I shouldn't have countered it. In the meantime, they have a bit of a fight here over torrential gear hulks, but the hits keep coming here for Brad Nelson. Yes, and he does resolve the Scarab God. It's facing down a torrential gear hulk, but Brad's at 22. He can take some hits.
Yeah, now we have some fireworks. I'll just mention very quickly that after Matthew Kling used torrential gear hulk to flash back Supreme Will, his play made a little bit more sense as getting the Supreme Will into his graveyard was valuable, just like getting the Champion of Wits was valuable for Brad Nelson.
He didn't have a counter of any other type, so.
Yeah, otherwise he was going to just do nothing and then cast Supreme Will on the next spell, but this way he got to have the same effect while getting the 5/6 Torrential Gear Hulk onto the battlefield.
Now he is facing some major issues here. Magma Spray plus Harness Lightning, that will take care of the Scarab God permanently.
Wow, and that's an example of the red cards being a big difference between these two decks in the matchup. Magma Spray, albeit had to pair with a different removal spell, but it was successfully able to exile the Scarab God.
Right, so plan A for Brad Nelson was to pick some fights, get some counters out of the hand from Matt, and then also do kind of his big finish, which was a Torrential Gear Hulk. Now, that didn't work out for him, but he had secretly a much bigger finish lined up, and he ended up sticking that. That hasn't worked out because it's been exiled. Of course, that was the Scarab God. And now he's got to go to plan B, where he's going to use the Eternalize ability on Champion of Wits and try to piece together another long-term game plan against his Gear Hulk. Interesting stuff. I like the jockeying for position between these two players here.
The card that's really been interesting to me so far in this game is Champion of Wits, and I'm going to be keeping an eye over the course of the match on how these two players seem to value that card. I'm really curious if Matthew Kling had Magma Spray in his hand when Brad first originally cast Champion of Wits, because while he did put the Magma Spray to great use on the Scarab God, an alternative play would be to let Champion of Wits resolve and Magma Spray it so that Brad gets to front load the draw 2, discard 2, but you actually preempt the most powerful effect, which is the Eternalize.
Yeah, where the opposite of that gets super interesting. If Matt had that ability, said, I'm going to use a counter spell on it, and I'm going to not use Magma Spray on anything other than Scarab God. Well, Brad's in an awkward position now. He's forced to kind of race here, it looks like, but he does need to find an answer for the Gear Hulk. Perhaps a Gear Hulk of his own. Cycle-fetted pools for Kling. Let's see if Brad has an answer, if he has to just keep taking hits. His life total is going to start dwindling pretty quickly if he keeps taking 5 a turn. He's already down to 12.
Boy, Marshall, these cycling lands are quite good in Standard. You see in a situation like this, Matthew Kling has 8 lands in play, or is it even 9? He really doesn't want to draw like just another swamp or a Spire Bluff Canal, but drawing a cycling land, he has plenty of mana, plenty of time to cycle it, just lets him play an appropriate number of lands in his deck while not risking mana flood in the late game.
Wow, look at this from Nelson. He did actually have a Torrential Gear Hulk. He didn't bother flashing it into block or to remove the attacker. He took the damage first. Kling then went for a Harness Lightning to make sure that Brad couldn't draw extra cards off of the Glint Sleeve Siphoner, and Brad sprung his trap. He had Torrential Gear Hulk the whole time.
Yeah, so Torrential Gear Hulk just amazing in this game for both players, actually, but Brad's had hit 2 Torrential Gear Hulks.
Yeah, and looks like Matt's about out of gas here. Still cycling these lands, though, as you mentioned, really doing good work for him.
So he gets 2 fresh draws.
Still, he's facing down a lot of power, and Brad Nelson finds the long-term game plan, puts the pieces together, and his big hitters get the job done. You know, by the time that game ended, he had the Scarab God on the battlefield, and he had a Torrential Gear Hulk. You know, those are kind of his big top-end cards, and he was able to leverage them, even if the first few tries didn't quite get there.
Yeah, so pretty interesting to analyze the way that game went. While you could say that it was the Scarab God that eventually drew the concession from Matthew Kling, I would point to Torrential Gear Hulk and Champion of Wits as the major players in Brad Nelson winning that game, just because those were big, expensive cards that gave Brad a guaranteed advantage, even if they were answered after the fact.
Yeah, we saw the Eternalize there from Brad on the Champion of Wits really power him into the late game after his plan A didn't quite come together for him. I mean, that's a place to dump 7 mana for a very powerful effect in the late game that's difficult to interact with from Matthew's perspective, too.
I always find matchups like this particularly challenging to sideboard for because while you do want to make sure your deck is as powerful as possible for the late game, for those turn 9, 10, 11 situations that we saw towards the end of game 1, you want to pack your deck full of powerful top decks, 2-for-1 card advantage. But also, you have to realize that your opponent is trying to kill you with creatures ranging from as expensive as Scarab God and Torrential Gearhulk to as cheap as Glintsleeve Siphoner. So you have to have a proper balance of answer cards and cheap interactions so you don't fall too far behind.
Brad's taking a little bit of extra time with his sideboarding, making sure that he gets everything just how he wants it. Matthew, though, looks like he knew the game plan. There was a fair bit of this blue-black, versions of blue-black floating around the tournament hall today, and yesterday, I should say.
That's right. Brad Nelson's brother, Corey Baumeister, was 8-0 overnight. I think he did take a loss today, but certainly still topping the standings.
And Brad was 8-0-1, or 7-0-1, I guess it would be. Wow.
Well, it's definitely no surprise to see those two players at the top of the standings in a standard Grand Prix. It is always great to watch what decks they show up with, as those guys seem to have their finger on the pulse of the metagame more so than other top players.
I have an alternate theory.
Okay.
What if it just doesn't matter what deck they bring?
I've had that thought cross my mind as well.
Like, I always think, wow, they did it again. They got the metagame call. They got every card tuned perfectly, but maybe they're just really good, and you just hand them a ham sandwich, and they come 8-0 GPs.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way.
Probably a combo.
So, Marshall, one last thought about those cycling lands.
Yeah.
7 full copies in Matthew Kling's Grixis deck, 4 Canyon Slough, 3 Fetid Pools. I think the last subtle factor that makes those cards so strong in Standard is the ability to make the other cycle of dual lands come into play untapped, the Dragon Skull Summits and the Drowned Catacombs. I think it really makes a 3-color mid-range deck possible, like Matthew Kling's Grixis deck.
Because those cycling lands have land types.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, that is yet another bonus to those cards. How big is the downside?
Well,
I mean, you're facing mono red, and you really need that land drop, and you draw one of those. You're pretty bumming, right?
It can be big because the cards in Standard scale so quickly in power with each additional mana that you tack onto their cost. So you do see situations where, okay, this is turn 5. If I hit my land and can play the Scarab God, I'm going to win. And then, oh, no, it comes into play tapped. So that is definitely a big risk. But I think generally outweighed by the color fixing and the ability to prevent mana flood in the late game. One thing I always like to say is that I'd rather cast my spells a turn late than not cast them at all.
Sure. No, that's a good way to look at it. And like you said, I mean, Matthew was cycling a bunch of lands that game. Brad even had one. All right, game number 2 underway here in Memphis. We've got 2 undefeated players, though Brad Nelson does have a draw on his record. He still has yet to take a loss in the tournament with black-blue mid-range. Ooh, Deadeye Tracker.
Yeah, so there you see the opening of turn 1 tapped land, no cost to Matthew Kling, as his deck doesn't have too many 1-mana spells. And then turn 2 untapped Drowned Catacomb. Although I guess I say that, but he did cast a 1-mana spell, which potentially he could have played on turn 1.
Yeah, he did.
But it would require Basic Swamp or Ether Hub to cast that, so not too likely, even in Brad Nelson's 2-color deck.
Also, getting the Deadeye Tracker down isn't super critical. You have to, in order to start activating it, you can take a look there on the side. You have to exile 2 target cards from an opponent's graveyard and pay 2 mana. Doing that on turn 2 is an unlikely scenario anyway, and
right, so there's a wide variety of reasons why Matthew Kling might have turned to this card after sideboarding, but attacking for 1 damage on turn 2 is not one of them.
No. What do you make of the tracker? What's the deal? He's trying to tear apart his graveyard so he can't go off with Gearhulks and
Yeah,
Stuff
we
like the
mentioned the Scarab God as
Scarab God.
probably the single most important card on both sides of this matchup, but also the cards that Brad Nelson used to win Game 1 were Champion of Wits and Torrential Gearhulk. So having the Deadeye Tracker to manage those cards, if Matthew Kling had one in play in Game 1, for example, it might have been completely different.
Yep. Looks like plan A for Matthew is Deadeye tracking on the beatdown path here.
Matthew perhaps actually disappointed that his removal spell exiled the Glint Sleeve Siphoner, since he's now one card further away from activating the tracker. But he's still doing fine.
Okay, well, this is a little bit annoying for Matthew Kling. Walking Ballista.
That card's actually terrific against Matthew's deck, especially now that we know he's brought in Deadeye Tracker, but he has 4 Glint Sleeve Siphoners, which are a pretty important card.
Ooh.
Wow.
Re-raise.
Yeah. That's not a 1 toughness creature.
Not at all. So the tracker can die to the Walking Ballista, but at this point, Matthew Kling is all set up with the Scarab God. Now, there's no creatures in the graveyard as of yet anyway, so Brad has to really consider whether he wants to kill the tracker.
Yeah, that's a great point. The Scarab God, you normally feel a sense of urgency of answering it right away so that your opponent can't untap and activate the really powerful ability. But if there's no creature in the graveyard, it gives you a little bit more leeway in perhaps making a different play other than removing the Scarab God. But that's certainly playing with fire, as Matthew Kling's deck is full of 1 and 2 mana removal spells that could cause one of Brad's creatures to wind up in the graveyard.
Brad does have land number 5, perhaps a Scarab God of his own, though. He has to really think about his options as it comes to that. Ooh, is he going to pass? Look at that. Ega says, go. He does. He passes the turn back to Matthew. So Matthew does get to untap. What is he doing?
Maybe he is confused about the Glint Sleeve Siphoner.
Yeah, I think he forgot that he exiled it. Can't target that. They're going to ask the judge, hey. Yeah, he must have just forgot that it was Vraska's Contempt that exiled it.
Yeah, so good thing to call a judge about. I mean, clearly you can't return a creature from the graveyard that's been exiled, but also it's a little bit confusing because Brad has no graveyard, so it's hard to differentiate the exile zone from the graveyard. So I don't necessarily blame either player, and if I was in that situation, I would certainly call a judge.
Yeah, that's what you want to do there, just to make sure exactly what's supposed to happen from that point forward. By the way, you scoping that mountain?
Oh, beautiful.
Arabian Nights Mountain.
Yeah, for me, that's the number 1 ranked basic land. I almost would want to play red decks a disproportionate amount of the time if I owned those mountains.
Oh, man. I have one of them.
Wow, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm very proud of it.
You used to get those in booster packs in Arabian Nights, and they were probably not one of the more desirable cards back then.
People were throwing them away. Now they're prominently displayed. There you go. Take a look at that in many trade binders. They have the Arabian Nights expansion symbol. Still the best expansion symbol of all time.
Yeah, and you want to know one thing cool, Marshall, is Douglas Schuler, one of the most prominent early day artists in Magic. He's sitting right behind us right now here at Grand Prix Memphis.
Is he really?
Yeah, that's right.
What the? That's cool.
Sarah Angel.
Wow, he's right over there. I can actually see him from the booth. He's not kidding either. All right, meanwhile, we got some action here, Reed. This is a big sequence because we have Scarab God in combat. By the way, Brad's turn ended up being put a counter on my Walking Ballista. Not the most exciting turn ever. But Matthew really needs an answer for this Gearhulk, or else his Scarab God is going to just run headlong right into the 5/6, and that's going to be a disaster. What does he have? He has Vraska's Contempt, so he had the answer. Now, what's going on with the Deadeye Tracker here?
Well, I guess Matthew...
He just wants it in the yard?
...would prefer it to be in the graveyard than to be in play.
Okay.
But Brad's going to oblige there with just blocking, taking his free value, perhaps indicating that he is going to have a way to combat the Scarab God.
Has to be, right? If I'm Matthew, I'm like, oh, man. Because Brad would certainly just take the 1 damage. Brad has no graveyard. It's literally a 1-1 on the board. It's going to be Vraska's Contempt. Absolutely. Uh-oh, negate? Wow. Oh, he has the negate from Matthew Kling. Snapping that off, and this plan has not worked out for Brad. Yeah, and all he can do is play Champion of Wits. That is not going to get the job done. So Matthew finally gets to untap with the creature in the graveyard. Now, it's not the best one. It's just a Deadeye Tracker. In fact, it's probably the worst one. But
still quite a lot of value. I mean, a free 4/4, the ability to scry every upkeep.
Oh, what a blowout. Reed, explain what was going to happen there.
Okay, so Brad just conceded to a 2-mana removal spell that was going to kill his Champion of Wits. Brad already felt behind on the board as his opponent had the Scarab God, but Matthew's play was to kill Brad's Champion of Wits, ready with 4 mana to eternalize it, or eternalize it via the Scarab God right away, draw 4 cards, cement his advantage both on the board and in terms of number of cards in hand, and Brad just says, I've had enough, let's try game 3.
Yeah, and that was all in his upkeep.
Yeah, that's right.
He was going to get his scry on, everything, so woof. What a flurry for Matthew Kling as he evens things up 1 game apiece.
So I would love to know that game if Brad had Vraska's Contempt for a couple of turns there. It could be that with no creatures in the graveyard, he decided to take a little extra time to set up his board before answering the Scarab God, for fear that if he used his 1 removal spell on Matthew's Scarab God and Matthew just played a second copy of the Legend, then it would be lights out.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot to juggle there if Brad did have the Vraska's Contempt, and I'm really curious always to get in the mind of a great player like Brad, the way he handles a situation like that. If he just drew the Vraska's Contempt a turn or 2 later, it's a little bit less interesting, but still, a fun thought exercise.
Yeah, it's really interesting if you ever have a chance to talk to Brad, maybe if we're out at a GP or, want to get his autograph or just say hi to him. He thinks extremely quickly. Like, you can ask him about these spots, and he'll just break down everything for you, and it's like, wow, you were covering like 9 different factors, with each of his plays, and he is really sharp when it comes to that type of stuff. I love asking him those questions because, it's fun for us in the booth, right, to kind of put ourselves in those shoes and go, well, I would be worried about this or that. He's worried about this, that, and then 4 other things on top of it. You're like, oh, okay, this is why you're so good at this game.
That's right. In many ways, Brad is on another level. Most Magic players, including like a lot of top players, it takes so much mental energy to analyze the board state and focus on the best way that you're going to play with your own cards. But Brad goes 1 or 2 steps beyond that in thinking about what his opponent's going to do. He lays traps. He tries to make his opponent play into his hands a little bit. So Brad just always carrying a lot of information and a lot of possibilities in his mind, and usually using all that information to lead the game down the track that he wants.
Beautiful day outside here in Memphis. Reed and I had a leisurely stroll into work today. Went a little better than yesterday.
Yeah, much better than yesterday, where we showed up dripping wet, like a couple of dogs that had just come in from the park.
Yeah. From the parking lot.
From the parking lot,
that we crossed on the way here. But, of course, indoors, we're battling. We got Brad Nelson versus Matthew Kling here. Wow, that was a quick mulligan from both players. They just shipped those cards back. No love.
So I wonder about Brad's, I guess I'll call it his mental state or his body language, because he quickly conceded at the end of game 2 in a situation where he was going to lose, but perhaps not for a turn or 2. And then just quickly opening on his hand and mulliganing right away. It's either it seems to me like that would normally indicate frustration from a player, but it could also be just a little bit of I'm going to fake frustration to try to put my opponent in off their guard, or it might just be the way that Brad plays.
What if he's just on full blown?
It could be.
He's ready to just flip a table.
Brad in his younger days was, down to 5. I guess now it's time to be frustrated.
Now you flip the table.
Brad
Actually,
in his younger days, though, was sort of notorious for
scooping early.
Yeah,
I remember that. He would kind of see the writing on the wall and be like, eh.
And that's part of just Brad analyzing the situation so quickly and knowing the way the game's going to go.
Yep.
But that's certainly a quality that he has worked hard to change, and now he's not known for that at all anymore.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is that I think we can all understand, right? It is not fun when you, air quotes, know you're going to lose, to sit there and go through the motions, even though it might take 3, 4, 5 turns before you actually lose the game. But the thing is, and I think that this is the change that Brad has enacted in that. This was years ago now, but is that you're a professional. Take it. Soak in that pain. It's part of the deal, right? And then, because you get your 3%, your 4%, your 2% equity in the game where things go horrendous for your opponent and perfect for you. Only happens a few times in 100, but when it does, that's a game win. That's a match win, and you don't want to leave that equity on the table.
Yeah, that's right. Anybody can win a game of Magic when everything's going well, when they're making their land drops, when they're curving out, and when they're ahead. Anybody can play games like that, but it's battling back when you're behind. It's not losing heart. It's looking for your outs, however thin they might be. Mm-hmm. That really defines a great player.
Well, Brad is up against it here. Now, both players mulligan, but Brad mulliganed twice. And unfortunately for him, he is facing one of the better answers for that glint sleeve Siphoner with a Whirler Virtuoso.
Worth noting also that Brad mulliganed down to 5 when he was on the play.
Right.
Of course, in constructed Magic, being on the play is generally an advantage, but when we're talking about such an extreme scenario where players are so low on resources, not having that extra card on each of your turns.
Got to tap your mana, buddy. That is disgusting.
Yeah.
Direfleet Daredevil on turn 4, but with 3 mana available, finds a fatal push to take away the Siphoner from Brad Nelson. This is not going well for him. Now, can he scrap his way back in? This is a good start. Ballista can take care of 2 of the creatures on the other side of the battlefield.
Yeah, this is a great start because while it's not going to correct some of the disadvantages that Brad has in the game, it's at least going to protect his life total. At face value on the board, this Walking Ballista can kill the Direfleet Daredevil and the Thopter token and have Brad go from taking 5 damage per turn to 2. And, of course, when you're trying to battle back and make a comeback, first step is making sure that you just don't die. Making sure that the game goes long enough for you to have a few more draw steps and get something going.
Here's Gonti, Lord of Luxury. Brad says, okay. By the way, Reed, you see those sleeves Brad has? They say his name on it.
Pretty cool.
That's pretty sweet.
Yeah.
I want some Brad Nelson sleeves. So Gonti stole something, but I didn't get a look at it. Here's Argwell's Bloodfast. Now, that's an interesting one because under normal circumstances, that is a way to unmulligan. Mm-hmm. The downside here is that Brad is a bit behind in what has become a bit of a damage race, and he may not have that many activations available before he's just dead. So we have a kind of an awkward race happening there with Brad down to 12 already.
Brad getting maximum value out of his Walking Ballista. On the previous turn, he killed the Direfleet Daredevil to prevent the lion's share of the damage, but didn't elect to kill the Thopter token, now making Matthew Kling spend a full removal spell on it, and Brad still getting to kill the Thopter token in response. So effectively trading 1 damage for that Magma Spray.
It's getting some value. One little bit at a time, right, Reed? I mean, that is how you scrap back in after being on a mulligan. But it's only 2 turns before he's dead, just to these 2, 3 creatures down on the ground. Okay, well, this helps out a lot. This would blank this whole attack step. Oh, but Gonti had a little present there for Brad. It was commit
to
put Vraska's Contempt a card down.
Brad's own commit, tempoing the Vraska's Contempt and allowing 4 damage to come through. Basically invalidating this Argyll's Bloodfast. It's actually going to transform right now. And Matthew Kling just 1 turn away from finishing off Brad Nelson. An alternative play that Matthew Kling could have made was to commit the Gonti itself, which would have at least fizzled the life gain of the Vraska's Contempt and given him another shot at the activation of Gonti. But looks like also along the lines of the Magma Spray play the previous turn, Matthew Kling is just really focusing on attacking Brad Nelson's life total between Brad having a slow start, having the Argyll's Bloodfast. He just wants to get him as low as possible, as quick as possible.
Yeah, I wonder, are we going to actually see Temple of Aklazats get activated here?
We are.
Wow, I have not seen that yet. He can tap it, sacrifice a creature to gain life equal to its toughness.
This looks like it could be a big play here, Marshall. 6 mana indicates potentially Torrential
Gearhulk.
And he gets to choose which side of commit memory he's going to activate here.
Oh, cool. Are we going to see him spin the whole wheel? Oh, we are. Look at this.
We have to make sure the commit gets exiled itself.
Yeah, it actually got shuffled back in there, didn't it?
It did get shuffled back in, but I don't think that's the correct outcome.
Exile it instead. So, yes.
Oh,
it is still supposed to go to the graveyard after he
certainly it has to be on the stack as it's resolving. There's no way it can be in the graveyard as it's resolving.
Right, so we should probably make sure that we get that card out, because we just don't want to have a situation where that card becomes relevant. Remember, Brad's drawing 7 cards here. Yeah. That could easily be one of them.
All right, but let's not focus on the details there. Let's focus on how exciting this is. Brad Nelson going from 5 cards to start the game. He hits his 6th land drop, now actually 7 because of the transform of the Argyll's Bloodfast, and now he's going to have a full hand, and the Temple of Aklazats is going to allow him to recoup his life total disadvantage and get right back into this game.
Oh, my God. I didn't see how many cards Matthew Kling had left in hand. 3-ish, perhaps. But now they're all evened up at 7 cards apiece. And this is that small percentage situation that we mentioned where Brad has now put himself in a spot where if he gets lucky, and Matthew kind of bricked on these 7 cards, as far as not having things he can't answer, he could scrap right back into this game.
Yeah, now we have completely reset the game. The advantage that Matthew Kling has is that he gets to untap and use his mana first with this fresh hand of cards.
Which is a massive advantage, right?
It is a massive advantage, yeah. But Brad is definitely in much better shape than he was a moment ago.
Right, he's going to go back up to 10 life here. That was, by the way, an Abrade to destroy target artifact on the Torrential Gearhulk. And that's going to knock Brad right down to 6, but this is where things get interesting, you see, because Matthew has left up 4 mana, and Brad has a relatively short window to start deploying as many possible things as he can. Look at him. He is in business mode. Look at Brad. He's got a lot of information to process here with this fresh hand and trying to figure out what it is that Matthew could be representing here with all the cards in his hand.
Yeah, and look at the way Brad considers everything before jumping to any actions. He hasn't even played his land yet. He's going to really survey the board and think this through.
Gonti, Lord of Luxury, is sort of the feeler play here. He's also left up 3 mana, though one of them is the Temple. And there's a commit for Matthew Kling's side. So that means that Brad's going to want something else or a way to interact here. No, he's going to let that resolve. Does he have anything else? He's at a precarious 6 life, though he is not dead on board. Land. Did Matthew play a land on his turn?
He did.
Okay.
Matthew had actually been stuck on land, so he was he was down 5 lands to 7 when the when the memory resolved, which that in itself is quite a big advantage for Brad Nelson. 2 extra lands in play.
Yeah, especially with the cards flowing for both players off of that memory. Brad's deciding which land he'd like to play. He really would like a follow-up with the shields down, and he has one, but it does involve tapping the temple, but it's going to get 2 life back and take a threat off the board. That's Vraska's Contempt for Brad Nelson to put him back up to 8. He's only facing down Gonti now.
Yeah, so great news for Brad in the sense that he's able to take a threat off the board and gain a little life in the process. Of course, his life total is a huge factor right now. The bad news is that there's a lot of really potent threats in that Grixis energy deck, and Brad probably would have loved to save Vraska's Contempt for something a little stronger like a Scarab God or Glorybringer.
Okay. Well, Matthew attacks for 2 with Gonti and says, your move. No play.
Suspicious.
Yeah, I agree.
Memory makes for some just extraordinarily exciting games.
Yeah, this game has been super cool. Looked horrendous for Brad, who mulliganed to 5. Now, Matthew also mulliganed that game, but Brad was way behind, and all of a sudden, he's got a ray of hope. He does have to go toe-to-toe with 7 other cards, though, so it's not going to be easy. He's going to go with Champion of Wits, and Matthew immediately says that resolves.
Yep. Pretty unexciting play for Brad. He's going to see a couple new cards, but it's not a great body on the board and not a great use of 3 mana given the circumstances. But it does allow Brad to redraw the Gonti that, if you'll recall, was put second from the top with Commit a turn ago.
Would be a nice card to have on the battlefield to trade off with the opposing Gonti. And, of course, get some value going. Whoa, look at that guy's mustache.
Awesome. Just awesome.
Dang, he put some work in on that thing. All right, Brad's going to pitch a land and a Walking Ballista before playing an island.
So there's that same Gonti being cast again. Okay, and Matthew Kling going to use the commit side again. Oh, geez, not great news for Brad Nelson. He is on the chump block plan, and if Matthew Kling has 2 removal spells, this game's going to be over.
He had one of them. That was Magma Spray. Does he have some other way? He does, and that's going to do it. Matthew Kling survives a real super serious game here in number 3 and is now 11-0, Reed.
Yeah, so he is now a full match win above the rest of the competition here, 11-0 when nobody else has a record better than 10-1.
Wow, that's super impressive. And again, going toe-to-toe with Brad Nelson. Look at Brad. He knows how close that was. Did you see that? He looked up like, oh, I almost had that. There was certainly a window. Reed, can you give us a quick explanation for how the commit to memory thing worked? Because some of the people in chat were a little bit like, wait a minute, memory's not an instant.
Okay, so there was a lot of moving parts here, but the first thing that happened was Matthew Kling stole Brad Nelson's commit memory with his Gonti. Then Matthew cast commit to delay Brad Nelson's, it was Vraska's Contempt, one of his spells. So the commit memory ended up in Brad Nelson's graveyard despite Brad not having cast it himself. The next turn, Brad went from 5 lands to 7 by transforming his Argel's Bloodfast and playing a 6th land. Then he went tap 6, Torrential Gearhulk, and because of the wording of Torrential Gearhulk, you're allowed to cast either half of the instant in the Aftermath card in your graveyard. He chose to cast Memory, and from there the fireworks began.
All right, thanks, Reed. All right, it sounds like we've got Matthew Kling down in the feature match area. Matthew, hey, it's Marshall and Reed in the booth. How's it going, man?
It's going pretty well.
Wow, that was an intense match. Went to 3 games, a lot of mulligans in that last game. Can you walk us through some of the key moments there from game number 3?
Well, so I was pretty ahead once I started resolving like Whirler Virtuoso. I thought was pretty good on that board. Yeah, I don't know. It happened pretty fast. So once he flashed back the commit to memory, I felt like that was pretty much a desperation play.
Yeah, for sure.
Like I was going to get to untap with 7 cards first, so it was going to be pretty hard for him to win the game there. I tried to play it pretty slow at the end with the commit to memory that I had of my own and the Torrential Gearhulk. I'm not sure if that was correct. I maybe could have gone for a Scarab God play, but that's what I chose for.
Man, I got to tell you, you're sitting here undefeated. You're the only undefeated player left in the field. What were your expectations coming into the GP? Are you shocked, or are you like, yeah, this deck's great, of course I'm undefeated?
Actually, I was pretty apprehensive about the deck I chose to play today, but it's obviously been doing very well so far. So
yeah, it seems to be good.
Yeah, Matthew, in the third game there, we normally go into a matchup like this thinking that it's going to be based on the top-end cards like the Scarab God that wind up winning the game, but you really made great pains to attack Brad Nelson's life total right from the start with your Whirler Virtuoso and your Dire Fleet Daredevil. Can you talk to us about the way you chose to use your removal spells?
Yeah, it was mostly, I keep in some amount of the Magma Sprays because I like to clear off Champion of Woods and things like that, so I knew I had a lot of removal. I could basically use it freely. So being able to just, basically kill everything that he had was part of my strategy there.
It wound up being great, particularly because his plan was based so much on that Argyll's Bloodfast, and getting him low quickly really took a lot of the wind out of his sails.
Right.
In one of the prior games, Matthew, we noticed that you used 2 removal spells to kill a Scarab God, including one of them being a Magma Spray. Do you save those for cards like the Scarab God in this matchup, or are you likely to use them on other things if needed?
No, I'm definitely willing to use them on Glint Sleeve Siphoners or Champion of Wits or what have you, because I have 4 Vraska's Contempts in the deck and Gearhulks.
So you have a good plan for the the Scarab God anyway. Well, Matthew, congratulations on your fantastic start. Hopefully it keeps up for you. We're going to be keeping an eye on you from the booth. Good luck the rest of the day.
Thanks.
Wow, good stuff from Matthew down in the feature match area there. And, yeah, he has a plan, right? I mean, he seems to have answers for everything needed. We're going to take a short break here from GP Memphis. When we come back, though, we'll have more MTG Red Zone. Don't go anywhere.